on that note, Alex, I will turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thank you so much to the Florida Now folks for giving this opportunity to talk about sex work as it intersects with reproductive rights. This panel is going to explore how the feminist frameworks around bodily autonomy, labor rights, and reproductive intersect with the sex worker rights and critiques of the Nordic model. The conversation is going to be about the experiences of sex workers, asking, what does true feminist solidarity look like when we're talking about choice, care, and control? And I'd like to have my panelists just introduce themselves. My name is Alex Andrews. I am the co-founder of SWOP Behind Bars, and I am the program director for it currently. And then my panelists can introduce themselves. Blair, let's start with you.
Hello, I'm Blair Hopkins. I am the executive director of SWOP Behind Bars.
And Melodie.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Melodie KG. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the co-director for New Moon Network. We're a national intermediary funder and capacity builder for the sex worker rights movement and also supporting survivors of trafficking as well. I'm also on the board of SWOP Behind Bars and on the board of the Cupcake Girls as well, which is an anti-trafficking organization that supports sex workers. Thank you.
And May?
Hello, everybody. My name is Miss May, and I use they, them pronouns. And I'm the co-founder of Decrim 305, servicing the community in more ways than one. And we are a sex worker-led organization in Miami, Florida, although right now I'm in New York City. And I have a little bit of strep throat, so I apologize if I sound funny or if I struggle with talking. And I am also on the board of the Cupcake Girls.
All right, awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight and for lending your expert voice to this conversation. So I'm going to start out with, we're going to talk about bodily autonomy beyond the binary of choice. Blair, let's go ahead and start with you. And then once you finish answering, then we'll just let the other two panelists weigh in, and then we'll go to the next one. Feminism has long fought for the right to control one's own body. But for sex workers, that fight is complicated by laws that criminalize their labor. The Nordic model, which claims to protect workers by criminalizing clients, instead reinforces surveillance, stigma, and violence against those it says it wants to save. True bodily autonomy must include the right to choose one's work and boundaries and access reproductive care without the fear of criminalization. So, Blair, the question is, how can feminist movements expand the idea of bodily autonomy to include sex workers' rights to labor, safety, and reproductive decision-making, especially in the face of punitive models like the Nordic model?
So I think that the disconnect between traditional feminism and the sex worker rights movement as it pertains to bodily autonomy is rooted largely in a desire to have a really, really nuanced conversation about what all of these things mean and what the root causes of any systemic problems might be, as well as any societal problems and personal problems of affected individuals, right? And that is a really, really good impulse to want to have those conversations and really dig in deep and try to help people understand, like through a therapeutic model or a therapeutic mindset, why people do the things they do, what systems force people into situations that make them make certain choices. Like, this is all like really good, positive impulse and important conversations to be having. Unfortunately, where it doesn't translate well is into law, right? So that level of nuance does not translate well into making policy that affects the day-to-day. And I think that the most important thing that we can do is encourage us to continue having all of these more academic and more cerebral conversations about things like capitalism and patriarchy, and the things that form us into the people we become and why we make the decisions we do and how we exercise our bodily autonomy. We continue having those conversations while understanding that the kinds of policies that need to be promoted to keep people safe is an entirely different conversation, right? So we have to separate out, why is this woman, doing sex work? Why is this woman, making a choice around whether or not to seek certain types of reproductive health care, or, procure an abortion or have a child, et cetera. So why is she making that decision? What systems have all come together to lead her to the position that she's in? How do we mitigate harm? Things like that. And focus really, really tightly on what policies can we advocate for that work and keep people safe right now. We can deal with everything else later. We have to have kind of a more incrementalist viewpoint, and a more narrow focus, because the law doesn't really have room for that level of nuance and that level of enlightened conversation, unfortunately, just because of the broad swaths of people and situations that it has to cover. So let's keep our focus narrow as it pertains to policy and that kind of advocacy, and continue to have those really positive conversations within our communities in a more broad way. I think it's a big mistake to shut down those kinds of conversations and people who have that impulse around wanting to make sure that everybody is the most extreme version of safe they can possibly be. I think that as far as policy is concerned, and harm reduction and crisis management, keeping a narrow focus is what's important.
Thank you. Melodie, anything to add about how feminist movements can expand the idea of bodily autonomy to include sex worker rights?
Yeah, I think Blair said it really well. And I will just add, I think policy is really bad at addressing all of these things, right? Because it is so nuanced. But at the heart of a lot of policy is moralism, that stems from our history as a country, as a society, baked in, in certain, especially puritanical values, that have shaped laws and policy historically. And so when we're thinking about choice, true autonomy, we don't actually have that, in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to choices we make with our bodies and with our labor. So, when thinking about the sex trade in particular, I think it's important to note that the default from lawmakers and from societal intellectuals is to stop the sex trade, right? Because that thing is a crime, and crime is bad. Therefore, we should stop this thing. But something that I really like to put into the world and like to have folks try to think about is how capitalism is actually the bad guy, specifically racialized capitalism, right? Because the choices that we have to make as individuals and as women ultimately come down to, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to survive this next week, this next day, this next hour? And for a lot of us, it's really hard choices that we have to make in the moment. And so that are fueled by capitalism and our need to have to pay for things like housing and food and diapers, right? And so when we come up against the law that has this moralistic principle in it, along with capitalism, those two things, they don't often mesh. And so what we're really talking about is not true choice, but it's actually choice within state coercion.
We're going to talk about healthcare without handcuffs, safety, stigma, and the state. For sex workers, reproductive and sexual healthcare often comes with strings attached. moral judgment, surveillance, or outright denial of service. Under criminalized or in-demand frameworks, even seeking care can expose workers to the risk of arrest or loss of custody of their children. Feminist health advocacy must demand more than access. It must demand respect, confidentiality, and freedom from coercion. So, Melodie, what would a truly feminist model of reproductive health care look like for sex workers? One that centers consent, privacy, and self-determination over control or punishment.
Yeah. So truly feminist models of reproductive health care are pie in the sky right now because of all of the system actors we talked about, and in addition, healthcare, right? So capitalism, the sort of morality, policing, and the way that medical records are stored and shared, and the way that especially like insurance works, right? There's a level of disclosure that's deemed medically necessary in a lot of respects, that are really just ways of surveilling people, and reporting crimes essentially. So I think there are good, I will say this, there are good individual healthcare practitioners, right? I'm not saying that every doctor, every, OBGYN is evil, certainly not. It's really a systemic issue. And for me, this goes again back to capitalism being the bad guy, right? The most marginalized folks don't have access to healthcare, and when they do, it's subpar because it's subsidized. And even when folks do get the care that they need, there's guilt, there's misunderstandings from the healthcare providers themselves. There's just not enough advocacy happening within the healthcare system that really makes for a truly feminist and equitable care system to be a reality for a lot of folks. So I think it all starts with affordability and access, and then from there it's about how we treat people, even if folks are doing something that maybe isn't agreeable or isn't ideal or isn't, whatever. We have, I think, an obligation to, as Blair said earlier, to really reduce harms that are happening right now so that people can care for themselves and also have like the knowledge that they need to make really well-informed decisions. I think that's one of the things that healthcare, especially repro healthcare, does really, really poorly is adequately inform patients about risks, about costs, about intricacies with their bodies, and they don't often trust the folks that they are seeing to really self-advocate, self-report what's actually going on. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and it again starts with reforming how we can access healthcare, and what it looks like for any given individual.
Blair, as a person who has spent a lot of time working on insurance issues over the past year with SWOP, what do you feel like reproductive health care could have an added benefit to sex workers if it was centering consent, privacy, and self-determination?
Well, I just want to add on to Melodie's excellent statement there and put it out there that we need to, both on a personal level, an advocacy level, and a societal level, be more punitive to providers that do not respect consent and privacy. The laws around consent and privacy in medical practice exist for a reason, and they need to be robustly enforced. And I think that a really important part of our advocacy is advocating for appropriate levels of punitive action for providers that do not respect those laws. So I just wanted to add that on there. It's the one place where I'm a little carceral. Is like report them. What I will say is that, and sorry, we have a 9-year-old chittering in the background. So what I will say is that as far as the benefits to sex workers, if things like reproductive health care are more accessible, when people have access to reproductive health care, they are less likely to get into the dire straits that put them in a position to be exploited. Whether that is in a traditional employment capacity or in the sex industry. So if somebody is being crushed by medical bills, and in fact, recently the federal government has made moves. There was an executive order to rescind the executive order that had previously kept medical debt from your credit report. That was a huge, huge relief to millions and millions of people, many of whom also are in the sex trade. Medical debt going back on credit reports means that people are going to feel much more responsible to resolve that debt in ways that they might not otherwise. And that is not a positive thing. I know that for the crowd that believes that, well, you incurred the bill, I think everybody here in this webinar understands that the healthcare situation in the United States is subpar, if I wanted to be extremely generous. So putting people in positions like advocating for policies like, again, making medical debt not applicable to your credit report. I have one client right now who had a baby, and after her insurance, and she had good insurance at the time, still owes like $9,000 for the birth of her child, who spent several weeks in the NICU. She's having to make really hard choices about how she's going to manage those bills, because if they go to collections and they go on her credit report, that's going to really adversely affect her family. So that is one thing. Just like the logistics, the really boring bureaucratic parts of how our healthcare system works and how it impacts people on the day-to-day is something that we need to have a lot of focus on in our advocacy. Additionally, the availability of reproductive health care, that enables, that like empowers people to have like full consent and awareness of their choices when it comes to family planning. If people are having kids that they didn't plan on and they didn't want to have at this time for whatever reason, they're going to then, once they have that child, they got to support it. They're going to have to make hard choices that they might not otherwise have had to make around how they make money. So, allowing people to have the agency to make decisions around their family planning is critical, and it's especially critical to the well-being of sex workers and their families.
Thank you both so much. We're going to go to policing parenthood, reproductive justice for sex worker families. Reproductive justice means the right to parent in safe, supportive conditions. But for sex workers, parenting is often treated as proof of unfitness. Nordic-style laws and mandatory policing policies weaponize morality against mothers and families in the sex trade, forcing many to hide their work or risk losing their children. Feminism must confront how the state disciplines non-traditional mothers and redefine fit parenting through a lens of justice and not judgment. I'm going to give this question back to Melodie again. How does criminalization, both of sex work and of poverty, undermine the reproductive rights of parents in the sex trade? And what would a feminist vision of family justice look like?
This is a really huge question that could be its own like a webinar, because I think there's so much to say about the criminalization of poverty, and how it undermines reproductive rights of many parents, not just folks in the sex trade, but anyone who is living in poverty or is poverty adjacent. The state really likes to pretend that it has the best interest of individuals at heart. And what it thinks that means is very different than I think what is the reality. So as an example, I mean, the United States foster care system has done so much harm to Black and brown families, to Native families, where, you know, even to this day, families that have specific cultural practices are seen as sort of unfit for parenting, and the state has taken away a lot of brown children because it thinks it knows better than its parents. And that system does a lot of harm to those children who have to grow up in a system who are put in foster care. It's really bad. It's really bad. And criminalization of poverty and sex work being a nexus point is really, really dangerous. Because as I said earlier, there are so many instances where individuals have to make really tough choices in order to keep food on the table. And sometimes that's resorting to crime because the state deems that whatever activity is a crime, which we don't have to do, but we do. And B, because racialized capitalism is kind of built with the intention that folks look and move and act in the world a certain way. And when that's not the case, you're deemed unfit to parent, you're deemed unfit for access to care, and to a whole host of other things. So I'll just say that, you know, a feminist vision of family justice is holistic and centers the individual no matter the circumstances. And its primary function should be connecting people to resources and providing resources, not penalization, not criminalization, because that really just makes things worse. It makes poverty worse. If you're in poverty and you're criminalized, your poverty is worse because of legal financial obligations, because you're not able to make a living wage for your family. Like, it's really compounding. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I know that was kind of a loaded question, but I'm going to go ahead and let Blair see if there's anything follow up about how the criminalization of sex work and of poverty undermine the reproductive rights of parents in the sex trade, and your vision for your vision for the feminist vision of family justice.
So the problem with family court is that it is jurisdictional, right? So it's extremely difficult to like impose a set of standards, any kind of uniform set of standards across what family court will do, what it should do, what an individual judge will consider. In my perfect world, how somebody makes their money would not actually be a consideration in family court. Even if it is illegal, because honestly, they don't need to get that. They don't need to get that deep about it. Frankly, in my opinion, do you have the resources to care for your children or not? Is kind of the question that has to be asked there. I will say that we have had a lot of clients who are parents. We have them all the time. Clients who are parents, many of whom, because of the punitive nature of the family court system and the CPS system, the foster care system. Are very, very afraid to seek out resources. And then as a result of that, if you are afraid to tell the Salvation Army or whoever it is that you're going to for resources, or a caseworker with CPS, what you do for a living, you're not going to get the resources that you need, and you're going to be perpetually forced into riskier and riskier situations in order to meet that need. And then when you couple that with things like a lack of access to reproductive health care, you're going to end up with negative health outcomes reproductively, but you're also going to end up with more children that are needing to be supported by the tough choices that a parent is making. So that becomes like a snake eating its own tail of poverty and dysfunction for people. And when people's children are taken from them, the trauma of that experience for the children perpetuates a terrible cycle, but for the parents, the trauma of that is also incredible, and leaves them at really serious risk, because when people are deeply traumatized, they don't make better choices, right, for themselves or anybody else. They often are not able to meet the moment to get their kids back because they're so traumatized by what they're going through. I had a client not too long ago who had done online sex work throughout her pregnancy in order to give herself comfortable maternity leave. And when she and her partner broke up shortly after the baby was born, he then tried to use that against her in family court, even though he was in a lot of that online content with her, right? And that was successful. They ended up with 50-50, largely because he was able to leverage that against her. And the impact that that had on that client's mental health is something that she will have to deal with for the rest of her life. And it impacts everything about the way that she parents now. We have another client who is a sex worker, a consensual adult sex worker, who has a child already, became pregnant, and did not feel like they could bring another child into the world and support it and do everything they needed to do. So they were seeking to terminate the pregnancy. And they were reticent because of the potential for having to take time off of work, not being able to do the work that was paying the bills while having a reproductive issue happening. They were also really concerned about talking to any medical providers about what they did for a living, because they were afraid for their safety and for the custodial situation of their current child. We've had clients, we had a client not too long ago who had a child and expressed to her caseworker with like a housing assistance program that because of the addition of this child, she would probably return to the strip club to make ends meet. She had like a part-time call center job, and it just really wasn't pulling it together. And she thought, well, I might just go back to stripping for a while once I'm recovered postpartum. That case manager at that nonprofit housing assistance organization called CPS. Have fun, guys. That client then went into the wind, and we never heard from her again. We never heard from her again. We have no idea what the status is of her children, how she's doing, if they're alive. Like we don't know. So that breakage of trust was incredibly detrimental. Let's see. I've kind of lost the plot on the question now, but what I will say is that criminalization is the core of where stigma comes from, and the stigma around sex work, both for women who are and are not parents, is the core issue of what leads to bad outcomes because they have bad service interactions, right? So if there wasn't a stigma, that caseworker would not have, if they didn't have a stigma around that and the safety and whether or not it was right or okay for this young mother to be doing sex work, she wouldn't have called CPS, and we would know where that woman is and whether or not she was safe and what kind of support she and her children needed. Right? So it all comes back to criminalization. Criminalization causes stigma, which causes negative healthcare outcomes, negative mental health care outcomes, causes trauma, perpetuates this cycle of poverty and disorder.
Thank you both so much. We're going to go to policing parenthood, reproductive justice for sex worker families. Reproductive justice means the right to parent in safe, supportive conditions. But for sex workers, parenting is often treated as proof of unfitness. Nordic-style laws and mandatory policing policies weaponize morality against mothers and families in the sex trade, forcing many to hide their work or risk losing their children. Feminism must confront how the state disciplines non-traditional mothers and redefine fit parenting through a lens of justice and not judgment. I'm going to give this question back to Melodie again. How does criminalization, both of sex work and of poverty, undermine the reproductive rights of parents in the sex trade? And what would a feminist vision of family justice look like?
This is a really huge question that could be its own like a webinar. Because I think there's so much to say about the criminalization of poverty, and how it undermines reproductive rights of many parents, not just folks in the sex trade, but anyone who is living in poverty or is poverty adjacent. The state really likes to pretend that it has the best interest of individuals at heart. And what it thinks that means is very different than I think what is the reality. So as an example, I mean, the United States foster care system has done so much harm to Black and brown families, to Native families, where, even to this day, families that have specific cultural practices are seen as sort of unfit for parenting, and the state has taken away a lot of brown children because it thinks it knows better than its parents. And that system does a lot of harm to those children who have to grow up in a system who are put in foster care. It's really bad. It's really bad. And criminalization of poverty and sex work being a nexus point is really, really dangerous. Because as I said earlier, there are so many instances where individuals have to make really tough choices in order to keep food on the table. And sometimes that's resorting to crime because the state deems that whatever activity is a crime, which we don't have to do, but we do. And B, because racialized capitalism is kind of built with the intention that folks look and move and act in the world a certain way. And when that's not the case, you're deemed unfit to parent, you're deemed unfit for access to care, and to a whole host of other things. So I'll just say that, a feminist vision of family justice is holistic and centers the individual no matter the circumstances. And its primary function should be connecting people to resources and providing resources, not penalization, not criminalization, because that really just makes things worse. It makes poverty worse. If you're in poverty and you're criminalized, your poverty is worse because of legal financial obligations, because you're not able to make a living wage for your family. Like, it's really compounding. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I know that was kind of a loaded question, but I'm going to go ahead and let Blair see if there's anything follow up about how the criminalization of sex work and of poverty undermine the reproductive rights of parents in the sex trade, and your vision for your vision for the feminist vision of family justice.
So the problem with family court is that it is jurisdictional, right? So it's extremely difficult to impose a set of standards, any kind of uniform set of standards across what family court will do, what it should do, what an individual judge will consider. In my perfect world, how somebody makes their money would not actually be a consideration in family court. even if it is illegal, because honestly, they don't need to get that. They don't need to get that deep about it. Frankly, in my opinion, do you have the resources to care for your children or not? Is kind of the question that has to be asked there. I will say that we have had a lot of clients who are parents. We have them all the time. Clients who are parents, many of whom, because of the punitive nature of the family court system and the CPS system, the foster care system, are very, very afraid to seek out resources. And then as a result of that, if you are afraid to tell the Salvation Army or whoever it is that you're going to for resources, or a caseworker with CPS, what you do for a living, you're not going to get the resources that you need, and you're going to be perpetually forced into riskier and riskier situations in order to meet that need. And then when you couple that with things like a lack of access to reproductive health care, you're going to end up with negative health outcomes reproductively, but you're also going to end up with more children that are needing to be supported by the tough choices that a parent is making. So that becomes like a snake eating its own tail of poverty and dysfunction for people. And when people's children are taken from them, the trauma of that experience for the children perpetuates a terrible cycle. But for the parents, the trauma of that is also incredible, and leaves them at really serious risk, because when people are deeply traumatized, they don't make better choices, right, for themselves or anybody else. They often are not able to meet the moment to get their kids back because they're so traumatized by what they're going through. I had a client not too long ago who had done online sex work throughout her pregnancy in order to give herself comfortable maternity leave. And when she and her partner broke up shortly after the baby was born, he then tried to use that against her in family court, even though he was in a lot of that online content with her, right? And that was successful. They ended up with 50-50, largely because he was able to leverage that against her. And the impact that that had on that client's mental health is something that she will have to deal with for the rest of her life. And it impacts everything about the way that she parents now. We have another client who is a sex worker, a consensual adult sex worker, who has a child already, became pregnant, and did not feel like they could bring another child into the world and support it and do everything they needed to do. So they were seeking to terminate the pregnancy. And they were reticent because of the potential for having to take time off of work, not being able to do the work that was paying the bills while having a reproductive issue happening. They were also really concerned about talking to any medical providers about what they did for a living, because they were afraid for their safety and for the custodial situation of their current child. We've had clients, we had a client not too long ago who had a child and expressed to her caseworker with like a housing assistance program that because of the addition of this child, she would probably return to the strip club to make ends meet. She had like a part-time call center job, and it just really wasn't pulling it together. And she thought, well, I might just go back to stripping for a while once I'm recovered postpartum. That case manager at that nonprofit housing assistance organization called CPS. Have fun, guys. That client then went into the wind, and we never heard from her again. We never heard from her again. We have no idea what the status is of her children, how she's doing, if they're alive. Like we don't know. So that breakage of trust was incredibly detrimental. Let's see. I've kind of lost the plot on the question now, but what I will say is that criminalization is the core of where stigma comes from, and the stigma around sex work, both for women who are and are not parents, is the core issue of what leads to bad outcomes because they have bad service interactions, right? So if there wasn't a stigma, that caseworker would not have, if they didn't have a stigma around that and the safety and whether or not it was right or okay for this young mother to be doing sex work, she wouldn't have called CPS, and we would know where that woman is and whether or not she was safe and what kind of support she and her children needed. Right. So it all comes back to criminalization. Criminalization causes stigma, which causes negative healthcare outcomes, negative mental health care outcomes, causes trauma, perpetuates this cycle of poverty and disorder.
Thank you so much. And yes, I do believe that one of the things that we can say, even from the first half of this panel, is the cyclical nature of this particular issue. So we're going to go on to Rescue Isn't Liberation, Reclaiming Reproductive Justice from Carceral Feminism. Anti-trafficking rhetoric often borrows the language of feminism and reproductive justice, safety, protection, and choice, while enacting state violence through raids, forced rehabilitation, and coerced medical interventions. The Nordic model's rescue logic frames sex workers as victims in need of saving rather than in people in need of rights. Feminist movements must reject carceral feminism and build frameworks that honor bodily sovereignty and self-determination for all. Blair, let's start with you. How can reproductive justice advocates confront rescue narratives that make punishment as protection instead of amplifying sex worker-led models of care, safety, and autonomy?
Well, that's internal work that advocates need to do. That is stuff that you need to work out inside your own head and your own heart, right? About confronting bias. And there are trainings all across the NGO, nonprofit, service work sector about how to identify and cope with and change your internal biases, like your subconscious biases. Those are generally centered around race and often around class, but it's very, very, very limited when it comes to what people do for a living. And I think that there are a lot of folks out there who have the best of intentions, have really good hearts, and probably bring a lot of good to the communities and to the clients they serve, but they don't realize that the folks who are in the sex trade who seek their services are not getting the care that they could get because there is unconscious bias there. So I think that we all need to be constantly, looking internally. If we are because this is hard work. This is hard work mentally and emotionally for case managers, for social workers, for anybody who's providing care and resources to people. And so, similar to parenting or anything else, any kind of situation where you are in a power position providing resources to people, you have to be constantly doing the internal work to make sure that your head is on straight enough that you can guide the ship for people, or you can help them get where they say they need to go, right? So adopting true harm reduction models, increasing the widening the scope of trainings around things like unconscious bias and consent, bringing in more sex worker-led groups who can facilitate that kind of training, I think is critical.
Thank you very much. Melodie, do you have anything to add to how reproductive justice advocates can confront these rescue narratives that mask punishment as protection and amplify sex worker-led models of care, safety, and autonomy?
Yeah, absolutely. And Miss May, glad you're back. Hope everything's okay. Good to see you. So I think the first thing that reproductive justice advocates need to do to confront this rescue narrative is first recognize it, because it's really insidious and it's really hard to recognize. Because again, that narrative utilizes social justice language that sounds really good, right? Rescue and protection, right? Those safety, those sound like good things. But it takes a little bit of digging underneath the hood to really understand where an organization is prioritizing its clientele, what values it actually has. And so I think recognizing it is the first step. And where it's not immediately recognizable, it's okay to do some digging, right? It's okay to ask questions of an organization or of a coalition or of an individual who utilizes that language, and just ask for more clarity. Where does this language come from? What are your values surrounding choice and circumstance? And why use this type of language, right? It's okay and even quite necessary at times to have an organization or an individual unpack that for themselves so that you can start to see, okay, this ethic that they're touting is maybe not aligned with what I'm trying to do, right? Not everyone has to be the educator in that, but we should be really, really prudent and diligent in who we're partnering with by looking at their language and really understanding and unpacking their values.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming back. Ms. May, I'm so glad that things appear to not be in a emergency situation. So I'm going to ask you to start off with this next question, and maybe you can put some of your Decrim 305 spin on this. We're going to talk about feminism without borders, building solidarity across movements. Both reproductive justice and sex worker rights movements emerged from the labor, organizing, and vision of women of color, queer people, and working class feminists. Yet mainstream feminism has too often excluded or misrepresented sex workers. The future of bodily autonomy depends on coalition, on showing up for one another against stigma and systems of control. So, Ms. May, how can feminist and reproductive justice organizations like the National Organization of Women and its chapters practice true solidarity with sex worker-led movements, challenging exclusionary frameworks like the Nordic model, while advancing collective liberation?
This has been a lot of the strain of my work in Decrim 305 is building coalition with feminist movements, with feminist organizations, where I think there is a lot of excitement about, like, on the surface of building a coalition with sex workers. Everybody wants to be in a Cardi B video, be in a Megan Thee Stallion video. Everybody loves sex worker aesthetics, essentially. But then when we start to dig a little bit deeper, when we start to ask a little bit more from the coalition, is when we start to see where the strain starts to happen. At least in my experience, right? And so I think, like, things like this are really important, right? Because, like, so often for me, I feel like used and abused in a lot of spaces. Like, I feel like sex workers are so often like just like a face, and like just like a token, like a tokenized check, check, got a sex worker, just so that we can be used on a report for a grant, like, because we got this funding for a sex worker thing, and so now we need to, get a quota of something. And I think that's when it feels like so, like, it feels like, sorry, I can't find a better word, but like, it feels surface level. It just feels like, we're just using sex workers and we're not actually helping them. And so, like, and that's been a lot of, like, unfortunately, that's been a lot of my experience in coalition building. I think that, like, if we're actually going to help sex workers, we need to prioritize what sex workers are asking for, right? Like, sex workers are asking for basic human decency, basic human rights. And, like, I talk about NHI a lot, no human involved. And I think, like, that's where it starts, because, like Blair was saying earlier, like, it starts with the stigma, right? Because the CPS worker wouldn't have called wouldn't have called if she didn't have the stigma, right? So it's like we would prioritize sex worker rights and sex worker asks if we saw them as people, right? But we don't see sex workers as people when they're alive, and we don't see them as people when they're dead. Like, we just don't see them as people, and the way that we constantly reinforce them as
Things
or
that Florida now
constantly
has done.
dehumanize them
Florida now
is
has
through the
gone above
law,
and
through
beyond
policy,
all the other chapters in
and
the
through
United
the
States,
media.
and they are one of
You
the
know,
only
like, we
chapters that signed a
constantly
resolution
make
into their
dead hooker
bylaws
jokes, and
that says that they will
so it's
not
just
support any
and
legislation
then
that sex
through
workers
you know,
oppose.
these nonprofits
So we are
and
grateful for your support
protests
as
and
well,
things,
and that
you
is
know, we
how
constantly like
feminist
we
organizations
don't
can
include sex
help
workers
continue
in
to
these
move along the
movements.
rights of sex workers a
And
little
so
bit
I
at a
think
time.
it's just
So thank
like
you so much for that.
actively
Everybody have a wonderful
fighting
evening,
the
and we'll
stigma
catch
and
with
like
you
not
next
only
week.
giving us a seat at the
Okay,
table,
All
thank
right,
you.
take
but
care.
giving
Bye-bye.
us a mic, giving us like agency, bodily autonomy to like be a part of planning, be a part of decision making, be, you know, like, if you're doing a sex worker support group, are there sex workers involved? Are sex worker voices a part of that? Are you speaking over sex workers? Are you speaking for sex workers? Or are sex workers like actually leading this project? You know what I mean? I think these are the things that we're asking. And I think, like, you know, we see this, like, it's so obvious for other things, right? Like, it's like, if we're doing something like involving race or gender, right? It's like, if this is a trans space, then a trans person should be leading this, right? If this is a black led space, then a black person should be leading this. It's so obvious, right? We've done the work on this. So why can't we see that for sex workers? It's very obvious. Like, 2 + 2 is what? So so we have to do that internal work and like realize, like, yes, sex workers are people and they need to have the same like voices and autonomy that we're giving every other group.
Well, thank you so much for the answer and for the math lesson. That is always very helpful to have. Blair, can you add anything to how feminist and reproductive justice organizations like NOW can practice true solidarity with sex worker-led movements?
You're on mute.
My guiding principle is each according to their ability, right? Each according to their capacity. So I think that, again, that's internal work that advocacy groups need to do, is think about what ways do we interact with the community, and based on that, on the outcome of that listing, like, let's say we are a housing assistance group that considers ourselves feminist, right? That's like feminist led or led by feminist ideals. In what ways do sex work and housing overlap, right? And housing need overlap. You're going to need to kind of detail out that list and figure it out, because, you know, or you're a reproductive justice organization, right? And you consider yourselves to be led by, you know, feminist ideals. In what ways does your work and the work of the sex worker rights movement, or just sex work in general, whether consensual sex work or exploitative situations where people might need assistance getting out of those situations, in what ways do those overlap? Where do you interact with this population? That's going to be the place to start figuring out how you can be more helpful, how the help that you give can actually be helpful to those groups. So it's not really a question that I can answer for you, right? You have to think about the fact that there is an intersection across every possible area of social justice, economic justice, racial justice, reproductive health care justice. Like, every single piece of what we do in this space has an intersection with sex work. So what do you do? What are your values? And where do they touch this population? Who can I talk to that does advocacy with this population to find out how my service overlap with theirs can be more consistent to what is considered by sex workers to be best practice? What are the best practices according to these groups? How can we adjust our approach to meet them? What might we be gatekeeping? Are there areas of partnership that might be useful? Are there funding opportunities that we can share in with some groups that are survivor led or sex worker led? Like these are all questions that reproductive healthcare justice groups should be asking themselves, that anybody in the NGO and service provision space should be asking themselves. Where can we include and consider this demographic?
Thank you so much, Blair. And just to let everyone in the audience know, Blair is actively seeking coalition members to join with sex workers because she is leading the charge to circle the wagons in this time of uncertainty. So we're going to close with one more question. Even the most intersectional feminist theories fall flat without material support. While billions of anti-trafficking funding sustain carceral systems and moral policing, sex worker-led and survivor-led groups struggle to stay afloat. A truly feminist movement must reckon with how it redistributes resources, whether it props up punitive institutions or empower those directly impacted. And I'm going to ask Melodie to kind of lead us off on the end of this presentation with this, based on a lot of your work with philanthropy. What practical steps can feminist organizations and funders in particular take to materially support sex worker-led and survivor-led movements to ensure that feminist dollars fund freedom and not punishment? Do we still have?
Melodie, you're on mute.
Thank you. I think what Blair said was true, is true here as well, that feminist organizations and funders of any size and in any region of the world or any region in the US really can and should do the internal work of asking where are the perspectives and lived experience of people who have traded sex missing, and how can we include those perspectives? And more than that, anyone can be a philanthropist. Anyone can start a giving circle. Anyone can donate a little bit of either money or time or energy to the sex worker rights movement, either with SWOP Behind Bars or with New Moon Network or with Decrim 305 or any number of organizations. Sex worker organizers exist around the country and around the globe. And actually, the United States has probably the least in material support to sex worker rights because of a number of reasons, mostly including how we criminalize sex work and the sex trade in general. So I would say tap into your local sex worker organizers. They're doing more than just fighting for decriminalization, even though that's important. They're also doing things like feeding each other, distributing mutual aid so that folks can get to get groceries, get to appointments. They're helping lift each other up through disenfranchisement. They're helping to educate legislators on the issues. They're doing public education around safe sex and reproductive care. Sex workers do a lot to help the front lines of democracy, and it often goes unnoticed and uncared for. But we're doing a lot of work to care for marginalized folks even outside of the sex trade. And so it's really important to include the voices and lived experience of sex workers in any programming or policies that you are sort of putting forward. And where you can, put your money where your values are. Make sure that if you are doing charitable giving, that the folks you're doing that with are also including sex workers and people with lived experience in their programming. And ask us questions. You know, we know that folks, the general public doesn't understand us or our issues or the intersections, and that's okay. We're all starting from somewhere, and we want you to be in this with us. So wherever we can help you all understand or unpack the complexities of this, let us know, because many of us are absolutely here to do that. And we want to build the solidarity together.
Thank you so much, Melodie. Miss May, do you have anything to add about practical steps that feminist organizations and funders can take to materially support sex workers and sex worker-led movements?
Yeah, I mean, historically, sex worker-led organizations have been extremely underfunded. And so I think that, I think that they could stand to fund sex worker-led organizations over other organizations. Absolutely. Put your money where your mouth is. And I would say it's important to remember that like a talking point I always bring up is that the decriminalization of sex work is anti-trafficking. It is anti-trafficking work. And there's billions of dollars that go into these so-called anti-trafficking organizations like Exodus Cry or Nkosi, and they don't give me a list of names of trafficking victims that they've held. I'll wait. Oh, I'm sorry. You can't. Because I know I can provide a list. I know Blair can provide a list. I know Melodie can provide a list. Like, that's the difference between us, the work that we're doing, and the work that they're doing, because we're actually helping people. And we're doing it on sheer willpower. Like, that's the thing, is like we're extremely underfunded, and it's just like it's sheer dedication going into it, and we really could use so much more funding. Like, imagine the work that could be done if more money went into it. So it's just like, and something else I like to say is like, because we talk a lot about like the separation of sex work and trafficking, right? Like, oh, sex work is not trafficking. And I think that, yeah, that is an important distinction, right? Because they are different. But something that I think, like, Revolting Prostitutes, which is a really good book if you haven't read it, I think that book makes a really good point in which, like, to say sex work is work, yeah, but and that it's not trafficking is not to say that, trafficking it's not my baby, not my problem. It is though. And as sex workers, we should be working in tandem with trafficking victims, because the legislation and policy that affects us affects them as well, and vice versa. So, like, trafficking victims and sex workers need to be working in tandem, and our voices need to be working together, and we should be in the room making these policies and legislation. And so, like, if the funding could go towards working in solidarity with that, I think, that could be something really golden. Gonna be golden. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this panel. Everybody, thank you so much for being guests on the panel today. Thank you, Florida Now, for allowing us to be on there. And thank you so much for all of your support over the years to sex workers and to SWOP in particular, especially those of us local to Florida here. All right. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? I'm only gonna give like 2 minutes. All right. Everyone go to your
I actually have a question.
Okay.
It's Ashley. I wanted to see if anyone had any experience with the disability intersection of this. I think it's a conversation that is really missed in this environment where accessibility to sex in general for the disability community is just completely ignored. And wondering if anyone has feedback about that on panel.
Oh boy, do we. Melody, would you like to take that one? I see you vigorously shaking your head up and down.
Sure. I mean, and I think Miss May probably has some good insights here as well. It's such a critical intersection. So many folks who are disabled choose sex work because it allows them to set their own schedules, work at their own pace, and work in ways that meet their individualized needs. And the classic 9 to 5 just does not work for a lot of people. And additionally, folks who are on disability, for folks who that's the case, their disability is not a living wage. It's so minimal. It's barely survivable. So folks in those situations often need under the table additional economic support in order to live and thrive. And sometimes that's sex work, sometimes it's nannying, sometimes it's, you know what I mean? It's cash, it's non-reportable, and so many folks that I know who are sex workers are disabled either entirely or dynamically, in a number of different ways, and it's a really critical intersection. So thank you for bringing that up. Miss May, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a disabled sex worker, so that's I do it. I'm a sex worker because I'm disabled. Like I can only work for a few hours at a time. I sometimes I can't work for a whole week, so sex work is the thing that gives me the flexibility and the income to be able to survive. And then also I want, something I talk about as well, not it, like it, because I think Melody brought up a lot of good points, but like, in addition to, offering flexibility for disabled people, I think it gives a lot of flexibility for families. Like a lot of people, because like, I understand there's like, there can be, challenges, um, if you're facing custody battles and things like that, but like there's a lot of thriving families in sex work, right? And so like a lot of people turn to this line of work because like they're like tired of laboring 80 hours a week and getting paid like shit, and they're like, I want to spend time with my daughter, I want to spend time with my husband, with my family, you know what I mean? And sex work allows them to have the income that they need to survive and then some in a lot of cases, and then also have the flexibility to do homeschool with their children, to spend time with their children, to raise their children, to do more activities, to go on vacations, like, you know what I'm saying? And so like I think like I know because a lot of times we talk about the challenges within sex work, so I think it's good to bring up a lot of the times the joys that sex work can bring. And so like sex work is it, I hate the word empowering, but it can be very bodily autonomy. It can give you the agency
Useful.
and useful, and the bodily autonomy that you need to really thrive. The American dream, if you will.
Yeah. the ability to survive.
I had one quick
Right.
addendum on that. As it pertains to disability, that is a really, really great place for established organizations to lend their support, because one of the things about disability that is really difficult to contend with is getting on disability. And SWOP Behind Bars, one of the things that we do for our clients, especially when they're coming out of incarceration, is help them with, if they want it, if they feel like they need it, help them with the applications for things like food stamps, things like Medicaid, Medicare, et cetera, housing, like all of this paperwork. And especially if people have been kind of systemically shut out from these systems, whether it's education or just like the knowing that those resources exist, having somebody who can hold your hand through how to fill out all this goddamn paperwork is huge. And one of the things that really, really has been helpful to us is organizations that have partnered with us to provide legal advocacy for things like expungement of criminal charges. And a huge gap in service that we haven't been able to fill is finding people who will partner with us to help people get on disability, right? Because you've got to have a lawyer. Doing it by yourself is borderline impossible. I know some people who've done it. It's crazy, but that's a huge place where organizations can help out, is be like, hey, we help some of our clients get connected with legal counsel to get them on, help them get and stay organized for getting on disability. Awesome. We probably have some clients that could really, really use help with that, and we're more than willing to coordinate. So those are the kinds of really tangible, sorry, I have a back scratcher. Those are the kinds of tangible places that more established organizations and more traditionally kind of like feminist organizations can find overlap to help and offer.
I have a question. Why do you think the established, or maybe I shouldn't say established, more the white female feminist is so unaccepting of the decriminalization model?
I think people are very afraid of disorder, the perception of disorder. People are afraid that they're going to see sex workers in the streets when they're walking their children to school. They don't want things that they consider to be like more crimes of moral turpitude, whether it's an actual crime or just a moral crime. They don't want to see it. So when people think about decriminalization of anything, they think about people, think of like open air drug markets or open air sex markets, like that. So I think that's a huge piece of it, is just the perception of crime and the perception of law and order. And I think the rest is probably around internal biases about, what choices would I make and what choices would I not make, and what kind of person, would make the choices that I wouldn't make, what kind of person would that be, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of stuff that we just don't face within ourselves.
I was going to say, I was engaging with some voters in Florida because weed was on the ballot with abortion. And, they were like, oh, but the smell, So I just thought that made me think of it, because they thought, oh, people are just going to be out here just ripping blunts. And they were so they weren't necessarily against it, but it was like that. It was like they think people are just going to be out here just ripping blunts, and so they that's how they think about it, is they just think people are just going to be out here. There's just going to be dick and pussy everywhere, so that's how they think about it. That's how they're decriminalizing sex. So there's just going to be body parts everywhere in the streets.
In New Orleans, we have a song for that. It is literally called "Ass Everywhere." But go on.
I think it's historical as well. I think, particularly second wave feminists tend to feel like they really did a lot of work organizing other at that point in time radical feminists to push back against women being objects. And women being second to men. And so to the point that Blair and Ms. May were just making, the image that sort of decrim causes, that in conjunction with the feeling of, well, we did so much work to progress past women as objects, women as like necessary sexual objects to their husbands, that it feel like it's a very guttural reaction that people have, that it's like, oh, this is wrong, because we did so much, like women shouldn't have to be sexual objects, or again, the conflation with all sex work being trafficking, right? Like, this is violence against women. This is, the sexualization and objectification of women. This is servitude. I think it goes back to that as well. And it just doesn't, people don't think inherently that the rescue ideology is bad, right? Rescue and safety and victimhood, like those things all sound appealing, right? And there's a big narrative funded by the far right around this rescue ideology, that wants to criminalize the sex trade, that is also coming up in tandem with this second wave feminist ideology.
Melody, that's so funny that you say that, because it just made me think, like, the first wave of feminism did so much to enable women to participate more fully in capitalism, but it still leaves the problem of capitalism. So they're looking at it going, well, but now we just made it so that women weren't just like inanimate sex objects, but now they want to bring capitalism into their being a sexual object. Wait, that's not what we meant. It's like, well, the underlying problem of capitalism still exists, and if you want us to be able to participate in it fully, that might mean monetizing objectification. You might have to do some work around that.
Which is like, sex work is like really the ultimate form of feminism, because it really turns everything on its head, because it realizes what sex work does is realize, like, I'm going to be objectified anyway. It doesn't matter what the fuck I do, because I live under all these oppressive systems. I live under white supremacy. I live under patriarchy, capitalism, and all these things. And no matter what I do as a perceived woman, I'm going to be oppressed. And so I might as well make a little coin off of it. Like, as a Chinese Cuban perceived woman, yeah, me so horny. Put it in the bank. You know what I mean? Yes, I'll be your fried rice. Whatever you want me to be a bee? Like, and because the thing is that they're doing this stuff anyway, and it's like, I had somebody tell me I was holding back the movement one time, and I was like, either way, I'm stuck in poverty. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's not gonna change your situation. Whether or not I put on clothes or take off clothes, I'm still stuck in the same situation. So what's the point? Like,
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. We're going to go ahead and close this off. Again, my name is Alex Andrews. The organizations that are represented here tonight are Decrim 305 out of Miami, and that's Miss May. We have New Moon Fund and the Cupcake Girls with Melodie, and we have SWOP Behind Bars with Blair Hopkins. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us.
Alex, I wanted to say, we really want to work with you all to change the position of National Now on sex work. And I pledge to do that.
Too. We want to work with you too.
I think it'll be great. And I want to thank every one of the panelists. You were wonderful, and I learned a lot. It makes a big difference. And Alex, thank you for putting this together.
Absolutely. We love all of the wonderful